All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, thanks to you all for jumping on here tonight. I appreciate it. Last month, we went over the investigative interview and we covered kind of a lot of that. And like I said before, I'm just kind of going through in my mind each kind of part of discipline grievance. That's kind of the most important grievance there is because ultimately a discipline grievance, even if it's, just a letter of warning, that's the path to termination, for someone to be removed from their livelihood. You may have a grievance for, doing the leave draw wrong. You may have an Article 8 grievance for the overtime equitability. Ultimately, at the end of the day, though, really being rock solid on discipline grievances is just so vital because that's the one avenue to where one of our brothers and sisters can be removed from the Postal Service. And so, anyway, just kind of that's kind of what I have in mind as I'm doing these is discipline grievance. Of course, you got contract grievances and discipline grievances. Those are the two kinds. But this month, I'm going over the information request, and then we're going to talk about working the grievance, kind of, what you do with the information request. Management issued a carrier a letter of discipline. Well, now what? So what I'm going to do, kind of like last month, I think it worked out well. I'm just going to share my notes on the screen, and you guys can just kind of follow along with me. We're going to do a little reading out of the JCAM, and I had a section out of the NALC Stewards Guide, which was real helpful. That I'm going to read. Hello, John. Good to see you join us. We were just getting started. I was kind of stalling for a minute to see if anybody else would get on, so I'm glad I waited just a second. I'll just letting everyone know we're going over the information request and working the grievance. That's kind of the topic for this month. Let me figure out how to share my screen. Here we go. Sharing is not turned on. Well, let's turn it on. All right, so right here is my notes. Management issued a carrier letter of discipline. Now what? What do we do next? Well, as you see here, Article 17 and Article 31, those are the two articles that establishes the rights that we have as stewards to investigate and to process grievances, as well as the right to obtain information for these potential grievances. Now, Article 17.3 says in part, the steward, chief steward, or other union representative properly certified in accordance with Section 2 above may request and shall obtain access through the appropriate supervisor to review the documents, files, and other records necessary for processing a grievance or determining if a grievance exists, and shall have the right to interview the aggrieved employees, supervisors, and witnesses during working hours. Such a request shall not be unreasonably denied. So, like with last month, we talked about the investigative interview, and then after that comes the discipline. And so, really, your first step is going to be requesting information. Once you find out about the discipline. And we find these rights here in these different articles. Article 17.4 says in part, the employer shall authorize payment only under the following conditions. Grievances, informal and formal, step A. The aggrieved and one union steward, only as permitted under the formula in Section 2A, for time actually spent in grievance handling, including investigation and meetings with the employer. The employer will also compensate a steward for the time reasonably necessary to write a grievance. So what that tells us is when you submit this information request, when you write the grievance itself, you have the right to be paid for that. So you get to do all that on the clock. Now, Article 17.4 also had some other points I wanted to read with y'all. Give me just a moment here to scroll over to that. I got this wireless mouse and it goes quick. Here we go, 17. Yeah, right here under 17.4. And so as you see here, it talks about, we have the right to investigate and adjust grievances and problems that may become grievances. We have the right to paid time. to conduct those activities, the right to obtain management information. And it goes on with the few things it talks about. One of the activities included, it's a broad range of activities related to the investigation and adjustments of grievances and problems that may become grievances. These activities include the right to review relevant documents, files, and records, as well as interviewing a potential grievant, supervisors, and witnesses. So you're also, completely allowed to interview any member of management that may be connected to the grievance that you're investigating. It says here, specific settlements and arbitration decisions have established that steward has the right to do, among other things, the following: complete grievance forms and write appeals on the clock, interview witnesses, including postal patrons who are off postal premises. So that means sometimes you may have the need to interview a customer. If the carrier is being accused of something that took place maybe out on the route or at a customer's address. Interview supervisors, interview postal inspectors, review relevant documents. So that's the actual time that you're going to be taking going through, your information request. You get paid for all of that. And it also talks about you can interview Office of Inspector General agents if you ever have to deal with that. So Article 17 is good for all of us to get familiar with, especially if you're a little bit newer, because this is where we get our rights to do these things. Now, the next one, Article 31, in 31.3, it says the employer will make available for inspection by the union all relevant information necessary for collective bargaining or the enforcement, administration, or interpretation of this agreement, including information necessary to determine whether to file or continue the processing of a grievance under this agreement. So even, if you're investigating it and it turns out, carrier wanted you to file a grievance and you start digging into it and it turns out it's not a grievance, you still get paid for all that time, to do the legwork and to do the investigating. Upon the request of the union, the employer will furnish such information, provided, however, that the employer may require the union to reimburse USPS for any cost reasonably incurred in obtaining the information. And so what they mean by that, let's say you turn in an information request and it comes out to be 700 pages that you're asking them to print out for you. That the union's going to have to pay for that because 31.3 lists these costs. Basically what it is, the first 100 pages of information are free. After that, it's 15 cents a page. But if the total cost of that, 15 cents a page tally does not exceed $25, then there's no charge to the union. So I sat down and did the math. It comes out to right at 266 pages at no cost. If it exceeds the $25 amount, then only the first 100 pages are free. Now, if it turns out to be that you need, a large amount of information, one way to get around the union having to pay for that is you ask to review the information. You can ask to have it emailed to you. I know some people have asked, that's what I prefer. I know some people have asked to put it like on a encrypted flash drive. So there's different ways to get around requesting that. And here in branch 458, I would definitely encourage you that before you have something printed out that's going to cost the union any money, you'd want to reach out to Ken, Bruce, or Eric first, to ask them their thoughts on it. And they're probably going to point you in the direction what I just did about, instead of having it printed out, let's just ask to review it. Let's get an electronic copy of it. And Article 31.3 also lists different examples of information we can request. And so let me jump over to that. And while I'm getting to that, on that same thought about, requesting information and it being a lot and we may incur a charge, make sure that when you write that in an information request, when you put the union request to review, if they give you copies anyway and then try to charge us and we didn't actually request the copies, we simply requested to review them, definitely keep a copy of that information request. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. Whenever you submit an information request, you do it in writing and you get a copy of it. And you have management sign at the bottom and date it, indicating that they received that That way, if they end up not providing the information, you have proof that you properly requested it. And then if your grievance has to go up the food chain to formal A or further, we also have it documented that the union, at the informal level properly requested this. So let me get back over here, 31.3. Okay, here's kind of the list, and I'll just go ahead and read this. Article 31.3 provides that the Postal Service will make available to the union all relevant information necessary for collective bargaining or the enforcement, administration, or interpretation of the agreement, including information necessary to determine whether to file or to continue the processing of a grievance. It also recognizes the union's legal right to employer information under the National Labor Relations Act. And so here are these examples. You can request attendance records, payroll records, documents in an employee's official personnel file, internal USPS instructions and memorandums, disciplinary records, route inspection records, customer complaints, handbooks, manuals, photographs, reports and studies, seniority list, overtime desired list, work assignment list, bidding records, wage and salary records, training manuals, postal inspection service, investigative memoranda, any reports from the OIG, that last one, Office of Inspector General reports. And it says here that to obtain employer information, the union need only give a reasonable description of what it needs and make a reasonable claim that the information is needed to enforce or administer the contract. So basically, we have to have a reason for requesting it. And it specifically says here, it cannot conduct a fishing expedition into Postal Service records. So what we want to do is, if you're requesting information, you want to make sure it's relevant to the matter at hand, and you also need to be prepared to potentially explain that to management, because they do have the right to ask of the relevancy of something if they're bringing it into question. So if it's an Article 8 grievance, you're probably not going to need to be requesting somebody's work restrictions. I mean, I guess maybe in some weird scenario you might, but you get my drift. Like, that's going to be outside of the purview of what you're looking at. You're not going to be asking for discipline records on another carrier if you're investigating overtime equitability. So you really want to just keep it to that scope. Now, anybody that's in here, I mentioned last month, you want to go to nalc.org. I'm going to pull that up real quick. And you want to go to the members login. So when you go to the main page, it's right up here, members only. And so if you guys haven't logged into this yet, when you do log in, it takes you to a whole bunch of helpful stuff. Grievance starters, and the NALC Stewards guide in there. And I would recommend every single one of y'all download that to your laptop and just take a little time every week, 15 minutes, maybe make it part of your weekend routine, and read a little part of that steward's guide. Now, right here, I kind of stole a little excerpt from it that I thought was really relevant for this, and it's on page 26 of that steward's guide. And it's under the introduction. And here's what it says. You may notice that preparation is repeatedly emphasized throughout this guide. The importance of preparation cannot be stressed enough. Organizing background information, completing paperwork properly, and planning a grievance meeting strategy for each case will help you be successful. The steward who investigates, prepares, and thinks before acting always has the edge. This is true regardless of whether or not the grievance is resolved at informal step A of the DRP, or if it goes higher. If the grievance isn't resolved at informal step A, proper and thorough preparation will pay off again and again at every step of the dispute resolution process that the grievance reaches after it leaves your hands. And I'm going to stop there real quick. So just keep in mind that when we're meeting on these grievances at the informal level, we have 14 days to file, after the incident date. And part of the reason for that is so that we have ample time to thoroughly prepare the grievance file. Don't ever wait, and I'll touch on this again here in a minute, but don't ever wait till day 9 or day 10. Don't be lazy with it. Jump on it as soon as you can to get that information request in, because if you submit an information request on day 2, they may take 2 or 3 days to get back to you. And then what they give back to you may not be complete. You may have to submit a second information request. Well, if you wait till day 10, 11, or 12 to turn that in, and they come back with incomplete information, that 14-day timeline is still binding on you. Now, there are ways to deal with that, but you just really want to avoid being put in that situation. That's one of the learning experiences I've had. I've had a couple times where I waited to the last minute, and it got stressful, and I didn't do as good of a job as I could have done if I would have got started a week before. Now, one time in particular, the carrier didn't tell me till day 11, about the discipline letter. So sometimes, you don't have any say so in the matter, but if at all possible, try to get that in the first day or two. Where were we here? Talking about how that the proper and thorough preparation will pay off at every step of the DRP. Remember, no one outside your office knows all the details of the grievance as well as you. So make sure you completely explain the facts of the case and all the people involved. Don't assume that the people further up the food chain, the representatives handling the grievance at later steps, will have that information. So you make sure you include all available information before moving the case forward. And so that was just one excerpt out of that steward's guide, and it is just full of helpful information. So I would highly encourage all y'all to download that if you haven't yet, and just kind of slowly become familiar with it. And on that same note about preparation and using all 14 days to make sure you're not missing something, documentation and evidence turns a contention into a fact, and facts win the case. So, for example, they may be, accusing a carrier of not being regular in attendance. Well, you may just say, well, sure, they're regular in attendance. But if you can't prove it, if you can't, look at, the 72s for this year and for last year to show that month over month, well, look, he's got a fantastic, track record with attendance. If that's not part of the information request and you didn't think about getting it, when you get into that informal meeting, you don't want your only argument to be because, management's, made up their mind, they issued the discipline. And, even though in a discipline case, the burden of proof is on management, you want to have every, tool available when you go into that. And the only way you're going to have that is if you do the preparation and put the legwork in. And so kind of moving on, there's not a particular order. It's not listed in the contract, under a certain article, this is what you do first. But the first thing I always do is determine the incident date. I just got a pop-up saying my internet connection's unstable. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, the first thing I do is determine the incident date. Now, the incident date is day 0. So let's say a carrier on June the 4th receives a letter of warning. June the 4th is day 0. June the 5th is day 1. So if it's a contract case, it's the date that the contractual violation happened. So let's say they mandated someone to work overtime that they shouldn't have done it, and they did it on, Friday the 13th. That's day 0. That's the incident date. And so on your 8190, which is the grievance form, it asks for the incident date. That's the date you would put there. And so starting with that date being day 0, you just count forward 14 days. And I try to make a habit of not meeting on the 14th day. I try to aim, for day 13 or 12. That way, if something comes up last minute, you get a flat tire and you can't go into work, or you get stuck in traffic, or, maybe the supervisor gets sick, or you just want to leave yourself a little wiggle room at the end of it. But either way, the first thing I always do is I determine the incident date. So the second thing I do is I submit an information request. Now, for any stewards that have been certified with branch 458, we have those blue folders that Ken gives us. In that blue folder, and there's also more copies at the Union Hall, we have multiple examples of information request. So you can get an information request that way. Definitely when I was brand new, that came in really handy. Another place is on the NALC.org under the members only portal. You have grievance starters. and it has the information requests there. And I'm actually going to stop sharing for a second so I can log in. And I want to show that to you guys just so you know exactly where those are. Because the first time I looked at it, I never even realized that if I kept scrolling down, there were information requests attached to each one of the grievance starters. Let me just log in here real quick. All right. So right here, once you log into the members portal, it's right under this blue hyperlink, the Shop Stewards Guides and Forms. Now that Shop Stewards Guide that I mentioned is also listed right there. So that's where you can download that and get your own copy. But if you go through here, let's say, just any of these. Notice a removal, improper citation, or how about this one, Weingartner rights violation. So you click it, it gives you you open it up. And you go through here, and this is what the grievance starter looks like. Now, if you were to use one of these, you would obviously kind of fill in the blanks and take those out, but you would also make sure that it's, you would kind of cater it to what your situation is. But if you scroll down to the bottom, so it gives you different contentions that they've already kind of came up with that typically fit that type of grievance. They come up with kind of like remedies that, the people at National thought, would be a good remedy, kind of a standard remedy. It gives you an issue statement, gives you different things there, more contentions. So you keep going down, and right here, National Association of Letter Carriers requests for information. And so according to this one, it says pursuant to Article 1731, requesting the following information for a grievance concerning a violation of Articles 5 and 17. And so then it, gives some suggested content there. It also gives a sheet to request steward time. A lot of times I'll put mine all in the same one, but you can definitely make them separate. So for each one of those grievance starters, they have a slightly different information request that's on it. So I'm not saying you have to use that, but that is something that you kind of put in your quiver, if you would, just to give you, other things to ask for. Let me get back to where I was here. Now, here's another thing. Let's say, you got your blue folder, but maybe you don't have it with you. Let's say, the grievance starters are on nalc.org under the members only portal, but you don't have your laptop with you. You also may be unsure of where to start, or you may be pressed for time that day, and maybe it's day 2 and you want to get a head start with it. More than once, I just written out my own information request stating this is an information request regarding the letter of warning that Mr. Carrier received on 7/11/25. Please provide any and all information management relied upon in making the decision to issue the discipline. So that's also never a bad place to start. Because number one, you are going to see what management states they used to base their decision off of. And second of all, you can always put in a second information request. The first time I did that, it was a station here in Oklahoma City. And what he sent me, I immediately thought of 2 things that wasn't in there. In that scenario, I actually didn't request them. I went and met with them, and I brought it up there in the meeting. I'm like, why didn't you check, this? Why didn't you check that? And he didn't have an answer for me. And I was able to get the whole thing just put down to an official discussion. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind as well. Definitely encourage you to use the ones in the blue folder, the ones on the nalc.org. Also, if you just go to Google and you type in grievance starter NALC, there's several branches out there that Google will pop up that have different grievance starters. And sometimes it's helpful to look at that because I've gotten verbiage from some of those that I hadn't thought of or heard of before. I really like, in this modern era with the internet and all these tools, we have podcasts, we have, all the different websites that branches have. The NALC's got lots of helpful information on there. Our own branch has a website where you're able to view all the LMOUs. A real easy place to get a copy of that. So really take advantage of all the, technology we have. But I wanted to kind of squeeze that in there too, that's another way to request info. And then if what they give you, if you want more, you can definitely put a second one in. If you do that, I would recommend that you document what they gave you in that first request. Because then if you do get into the informal meeting and you're saying, hey, you clearly didn't look at this, or this, and I got it documented here, what you provided me. And that might help you in that pursuit. And like I said, as it's listed here, if you can submit the second request, if there's more info you want that management didn't use in their own investigation, make a copy of it, have management sign and date that they received it. So when you give the information request, you want to keep that for the file, proof that you actually made the request. Because there are some members of management that if they decide not to provide it to you and you come up on the 14 days, if you don't have proof that you requested it, they could easily make the argument, well, I don't know, Joyce never asked me for it. I was waiting. She never sent it to me. The other thing which it talked about, I believe, in Article 31 is no fishing. Keep it relevant and just definitely be able to explain why you need everything you request. I've only really had once or twice that someone asked me, well, why do you need that? And then I was able to tell them, well, I want to see what their attendance records last year were and compare them to this year so we can get a full scope of if they're regular in attendance or not. I don't want to just look at the last 3 weeks, which is what you're doing. So the next step after you put in the information request, which typically I kind of do it at the same time, is requesting time to work the grievance. And if you're a little bit newer, or if it's maybe the type of grievance that you haven't worked on before, just start with an hour or two. Whatever you think reasonably in your mind would be kind of the minimum that you're going to need. Put that on there. And then if it ends up not being enough time, you can request more. I didn't have it cited here, but they're not allowed to deny reasonable requests for time. So it's absolutely one of our rights. And I think it mentioned it there in 17.3 or 4. So you put in the information request, you requested time. Now you're going to start working the grievance. So they give you all the information that you got. First thing that I always do is I go through the discipline letter and I read every single word of it. First part it lists here is compare the sites that management lists, compare them to the investigative interview notes. See if the carrier was asked about these. I was actually just talking to Eric Bew about a grievance today that I'm going to be handling tomorrow. And later on my lunch break, after I hung up with them, I got looking through it. Not one of the sites that they put on the discipline letter were asked about during the investigative interview. Not one. So they're issuing discipline stating, the ELM says here that you must obey these orders. The M41 has this rule and you violated it. But when you look at the investigative interview notes, and if they never once asked the carrier about that, how are they going to be able to meet just cause for issuing the discipline? The just cause principles, which is actually going to be the topic for next month, but those just cause principles are 6 of them. Is there a rule? Is the carrier aware of the rule? And as you kind of go through those and you compare the discipline letter, you compare the information request to these just cause principles, a lot of times you'll see that it doesn't, meet the standard for that. So that's an important part of the discipline letter to be on the lookout for. That's always where I start. I jot down the sites, or, if it's on the computer, or if I got the physical sheet in front of me, and then I'll flip over to the II notes and I'll just look through. Hey, they asked them 1, they asked them 2, they didn't ask them the next 6. And that's something that you would bring up and use in your arguments at the informal level, letting them know, hey, this is a little bit sloppy. You guys are accusing them of these 8 different items. We don't know if the carrier even knows those exist. So how are you going to issue discipline based off of that? And, I look up, a lot of times they'll have them printed out, but sometimes only have part of the site listed. If you see that, I look them up anyway to see what the entirety of it says, to see if it's relevant to what they're accusing the carrier of doing. I had one grievance. The individual was inside the LLB, had it running, thought he put it in park, went to the back of the LLB, and then the LLB started rolling away, where they were citing a bunch of things about driving. about when you're driving, you must do this. When you're driving, you must do that. I looked at the supervisor. I said, as much as I agree with you that those are, items that we all need to be doing on a daily basis, this has nothing to do with the incident that happened. This has nothing to do with what you're accusing the carrier of. So that's why it's real important to go through that discipline letter line by line and read every word of it. Now, a lot of times they'll have a DAR, or now they're calling it an AAR, administrative action request. They'll have in there sometimes a just cause worksheet that management kind of went through saying, yes, I checked this. Yes, I checked that. And then if it's a 7-day suspension or a 14-day or a notice of removal, it'll have a sheet for concurrence where they have to get a higher level official to agree with them before they issue the discipline, before they take action. So what you want to do is you want to go through those, and first of all, be on the lookout for any type of false information. They may put on there a date that an II happened. Well, you go look at your copy of the II notes, it could be a completely different date. They may put on there about an official discussion that happened. Well, check the dates. I recently saw one. They had the official discussion the same day as the incident. You're expecting me to believe that you had an official discussion with them about driver safety, and then he promptly left the facility and went and got in a wreck? So going through those, you're kind of picking it apart, if you would. You're kind of poking holes in, their idea of this being, just to issue the discipline. And like it says here, the official discussion date, that's a big one I always look for. And like I said, you read every word of it. Take the time on the clock, of course, because you never know what might jump out at you, that if you're just kind of skimming through it, okay, I've seen this type of thing before, I'm just going to breeze through it. Really take your time. And I'm not going to go real deep into it, but the just cause principles in Article 16, once you kind of scan through the discipline letter, at least this is how I do it. Once I scan through any other information that they provided, looking for obvious errors, obvious false information, the very next thing I do is I compare that discipline letter to the just cause principles. So the first thing I go is there a rule? Well, they may be accusing a carrier of something that isn't a rule. And right there, that's going to be a huge arrow in your quiver, if you would. And then you're going to, is the rule, equally and equitably enforced? Is the discipline that they're issuing, is that going to be the same type of discipline that they would issue in other circumstances for this? Carrier number one, gets caught without a seatbelt, and they may be given an official discussion or a letter of warning. Well, 3 months later, if carrier number two gets caught without wearing a seatbelt and they want to fire them, that's one of the just cause principles. They would not have just cause to issue that letter of removal especially if it's recently, but if at that same installation, they've, handed out a different form of discipline for the same thing. So I'm going to talk more about that next month and really kind of do a deep dive on the Article 16 just cause principles. Any of y'all that are on here now that are planning on being on this next month, I would almost kind of like that to be a little homework for you. It would really benefit you to go through and read all of Article 16, but specifically pay attention to that first part about the just cause principles. I used to have it like on a little notebook sheet of paper, and I just had all 6 of them written out. And then every time when I would start getting to a grievance, I would just have it there and just compare it. Okay, let's see number 1. Let's go through here. Does it meet that? Okay, number 2. And so that's a real good way to do it. Now, another part of, working the grievance is sometimes you're going to want to interview carriers about an incident. Other times you're going to want to get written statements. And so you might ask yourself, which one's better? There are definitely pros and cons of an interview versus a written statement, kind of depending on the carrier and depending on the situation. If it's interview questions, you have the opportunity to write them in advance. You get to kind of control, the line of questioning. You get to control to a degree what information you're looking for. So it's very targeted. And a lot of times when I'll do those, I use close-ended questions. Mr. Carrier, on Monday the 14th, were you at the office, working? Yes, I was. On that same date, did you see, Carrier, John Doe Throw away a tub of mail. Yes, I did. No, I didn't. In that same scenario, if I might have asked that carrier to write a statement, first thing that comes to mind is who knows what they're going to put. It may have nothing to do with this. Even if I kind of prep them in advance and let them know, hey, here's the topic. You were at work that day. I need you to write me a statement about it. These people are professionals at delivering mail. They're not professionals at writing statements. And I'm a professional at delivering mail. I'm not a professional at handling grievances. We're not lawyers. And so any opportunity we have to kind of simplify it for the carrier while at the same time getting the best information possible, we want to take that avenue. So if you know the carrier, if you know that they're going to be able to give you a brief, concise description of the problem and, be good information, then sure, a written statement might be better. If it's someone that maybe they don't feel as comfortable doing that, they might be more comfortable being interviewed to where you bring them into the, break room, office, wherever you get the time to do it on the clock. And then you can go through your, 5, 10, 15 questions, whatever it is, to kind of get the facts brought out. And, definitely keep in mind there's benefits, pros and cons to using close-ended questions versus open-ended questions. If you ask a close-ended question, it's going to be a yes or a no. If you ask an open-ended question, it's going to give them the opportunity to kind of elaborate on it. So there may be some questions that you want more information. You want them to elaborate on it. And there may be some questions you don't want to. So that's just kind of something that with experience, you'll get better at. Always have them, when you do an interview at the bottom, sign and date it. You could turn in 20 interviews from carriers. Every word of it could be great, to help the case that you're building against management. But if they're not signed and dated, number one, there's nothing to say that the supervisor you're meeting with is going to believe you that it came from those carriers. And number two, if it goes further up the food chain, if you would, in the dispute resolution process, Formal A, Step B, arbitration, those may get completely thrown out. So you wasted the carrier's time, you wasted your time, and then ultimately you hurt the grievant because you didn't obtain the information you needed. So always make sure that when you get written statements or interviews, you sign and date at the bottom. And then if you do decide to request a written statement from someone, educate the carrier on keeping it brief and concise and to stick to the facts. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll say, listen, I want 2 paragraphs from you. The first paragraph, I just need to know what you observed, what happened. On Monday, I saw John Doe, get punched by the supervisor. They were standing by the hot case, period. And then paragraph number 2 might be, how did this make you feel? Well, it made me feel scared to be at work. It made me feel disrespected when they spoke to me that way. It made me feel, that stupid when they were belittling me, during the stand-up talk. So if you kind of get the gist there, that's how I describe to carriers when I want a statement. I normally just try to keep it to 2 paragraphs. First one's facts. Second one is your feelings. Tell us how you feel. And the reason that's important about how they feel is, that matters. We deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And so if you have written proof that not only did something happen, but the carrier felt disrespected, the carrier felt like they're not a valued member of the Postal Service, that's going to help your case. So here's the other thing. If a carrier, and I've ran into this only once, but if a carrier doesn't wish to participate, kind of consider what kind of information you'd be getting from them anyway, if they're an unwilling, hostile participant. If someone says, no, I don't want to do that, you can go to them and say, hey man, let's, I really need this or whatnot. But if you can just tell that you're going to be getting, poison from them during it, try to see if you get the same information from somebody else. Like I just try to avoid that. I don't ever want to make a carrier feel like, I'm their enemy. I want them to feel like they can come to me. So if someone is truly just not comfortable with doing it, unless I absolutely, have to get that, they may be the only eyewitness to, somebody getting shot or something. I don't know if that makes sense. I just kind of, if they're unwilling, if they're hostile, just really think about what you're going to get from them anyway. And I just kind of move on if I'm able to. Now I had 2 examples of two different grievances that I worked. I went through and redacted the information so there's no personal identifiable info in here. And I just kind of wanted to show you some examples, one of an information request that I submitted this year, and just kind of show you what I went through with it. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so this first one here, this is actually one of the sheets out of the, hang on, let me take a sip of my coffee here. This is one of the sheets out of the blue folder that you get from Ken. And so you put your name, you put the date, right on here. You get to put how much time you need to investigate and review the documentation. So I mentioned earlier, you always want to request the time. The one from 458, our information request, has that right there. You get to list the grievance name, carrier John Doe, and then what type of discipline you're investigating. In this case, it was a letter of warning. They already have it here, a whole bunch of things you're going to need. Copy of the discipline, any and all documentation, information, testimony that was used to issue the discipline, any photographic evidence, video evidence. So you can kind of go through here and look at that. It covers a lot of stuff. However, sometimes there may be things that you want in addition to that. And so what I'll do is I'll just write them at the bottom if I have room, or I'll add a second sheet of paper. So I put here that I wanted to request the 3971s for all cited absences. That's the little leaf slips. Then I put down I wanted the 3972s for 2024 and 2025. Now, I alluded to that earlier. This was an attendance letter of warning, failure to be regular in attendance. And I asked for, last year so we could really get a full scope of it. And with this particular carrier, I went down and I did a little math and saw that they were in attendance like 98.9% of the time or something. It was a very high percentage. And so when I was meeting with management, I was able to present these documents and show them and say, look, if we go on a rolling 12 months, this guy's at, 98.9%. If we go over just the last 2 quarters, here's, what his attendance percentage is. And sometimes that'll be helpful because you're kind of showing a broader scope, not just the little 90-day window they want to peek at. I also requested any documentation that was submitted by the grievant for any of the cited absences, a doctor's note, any other, type of things like that. And also requested the ERMS employee key indicator report for both 2024 and 2025. So as you look through here, this was the letter of warning issued to carrier John Doe, failure to maintain regular in attendance. And so as I started looking at this, the first thing I did was I jotted down those dates. And I compared them. Remember up here, I asked for the 3971s. I compared them to the 3971s that the carrier signed to see if these indeed were true dates. I've seen before, well, they'll list something on there and the carrier was at work. The 3972s will prove that, because it shows every single day of the calendar year. And so that's one thing you'd look for. And then as I went through this, I started looking at the sites. Your explanations were considered but determined insufficient to excuse your actions. I kind of jumped ahead. That little phrase right there, when the carrier provided documentation, especially this carrier, and it was very detailed, notes from the doctor about what they did, what the problem was, why, he wasn't at work, I'll just point blank ask them, what of this documentation was insufficient to excuse it? They put this in almost every discipline letter. And so be on the lookout for that. And sometimes that's a very good argument to make. They're just blanketly stating that it was insufficient. Make, the burden of proof's on them, to meet just cause. Make them answer you. Why was it insufficient? What about it was insufficient? If they just shrug your shoulders and be like, well, I just think they deserve something. I had that said to me one time. So it went to Formal A and I wrote a statement and it was very helpful, that, hey, the supervisor didn't have any reply to my contentions. They couldn't tell me why it was insufficient. So when you go through here and you look at these different sites that they list, they violated 51143 employee responsibilities. Employees are expected to maintain their assigned schedule, go through here. Well, then I'd go to the II notes, and I'd go looking for it. Okay, did they indeed ask them about that? So as I'm kind of looking through here, these are the dates they talked about. I saw, was looking to see if those are the dates that match the discipline. Here's one thing they quoted, let them know that they must cooperate in any postal investigation. Employees' responsibilities. So you know what? They did indeed ask them about this. So then I move on to the second one. So if you guys kind of see how I do that, I go through each step or each line of that discipline letter, and I compare it to what was in the II notes. Now this other grievance, this one was for a 14-day. Okay, look at all these sites they have: loyalty, discharge of duties, responsibilities, performing all duties in a safe manner, driving defensively, professionally, driver's responsibilities. They quote, so these were all from the ELM. Then they quote some stuff from the M41: conduct your work in a safe manner so as not to endanger yourself or others. Safety practices. Like, I was getting tired just reading through all the sites they had in here. Postal security, obedience to orders, disciplinary, all these things. So then when I went to the II notes, here was the II. As you can see, I got all the information redacted, so nobody, could figure out who this is about. They asked them there: employees must cooperate. Do you understand? Look at the rest of this, everybody. Every question they asked them, there's no cites. They did not ask them about one of the, parts of the handbooks or manuals that they're accusing them of violating. So I keep going through here, and then it ends, do you need EAP and all that. So this is an example that when you go through this letter, I tore this to shreds. I went in there and I told them, I said, this was the sloppiest, discipline letter I've ever seen. The carrier admitted to it, but I got it from a 14-day down to 3 months of a 7-day, and then after that for 12 months a letter of warning. And I really kind of, my gut wanted me to have the whole thing thrown out because this was so sloppy, but I sought some advice. I stepped out and I called Eric Bew and asked his opinion, and we kind of discussed what would occur if this went to Formal A, what would occur if this went to Step B, or if this went to arbitration. And given that this was a rollaway runaway, there was a chance that somebody higher in the dispute resolution process might overlook these procedural errors. But I'll tell you what, when I was in there with the supervisor and we were kind of going through this, he had nothing to say. I'm like, dude, you can accuse of whatever you want, but you got to be able to prove it. And if you don't at least, can prove that the carrier knew about all these things, that's a massive fatal flaw. So I just kind of wanted to show you a couple of these, just a little touch of what I do, the process I go through. I talked earlier about the administrative action request. And, when it's listed in here, it shows initially the first supervisor wanted to remove Mr. Carrier. And you go through here, and I just started reading it, looking for any falsehoods, looking for something that was wrong. You read every word. I looked at the date. Okay, was that the date it occurred? I've seen times when the date was wrong. And, it could have been a Sunday when he wasn't, he or she wasn't even there. And so you go through that and you look here, and this is where you get concurrence. And it shows, from another higher level member of management. They got somebody from another station, the station manager, to sign off that they agreed this carrier needed to be removed. Well, you always look at the dates on there. What if they put the date the day before the incident occurred? That's a massive problem. So this is what, that steward's guide was talking about: preparation and, putting that effort in. It's so that you find little details like this that might be off. One detail for sure I found in here: for minor offenses, with the employee forewarned of the disciplinary consequences for failure to follow the rule. Note: for attendance-related discipline, an attendance review is not an official job discussion. They marked yes on this, and then they didn't even put a date. Now, personally, I wouldn't expect them to have an official discussion with someone about having a rollaway runaway. But the fact is, they marked yes, they had one, and they did not list the date of the discussion. You'll see this sometimes when they have one of these sheets that I believe it's called the Just Cause worksheet that management goes over. Go through that with the fine tooth comb. You'll be shocked how many errors or inconsistencies. This one here, date of the PDI, that means pre-disciplinary interview. And then it also means II. They wrote on here, the employee is not reported to work. Well, I got proof he was at work. Because his name was listed on the the II, and so it was just sloppiness. And then so you always go through here and you look at these things to see if there's any errors, and you look at what questions they asked during the II. So hopefully some of that was helpful there. I wanted to touch on this. We got about 5 or 6 minutes left. What do you do if they don't provide information or you requested? Well, you immediately submit a second information request. Quite recently, I had to submit a third one to a station manager. And once again, you document it. You have it signed, you have it dated, and you keep that copy, for it. You would also, if they don't provide the information, you'd write a statement for the union's Formal A representative, whoever this is going to go to. Because I'm going to say if they're not going to provide the information, you're not going to get an agreement at the informal level. I would be shocked, right? And so then you would file a grievance under Article 17 and Article 31. And, even before I file a grievance, I'll let them know, hey, in one of your own handbooks, EL 921, page 3 and 4, very clearly explain that management has to provide this information. So, we want this information because it's all about throwing rocks at their argument. I think I mentioned before, like poking holes in the argument. You may not be able to hang your hat on the fact that they maybe put the wrong date for a official discussion, or in this instance, they had no date. I may not be able to hang my hat on the fact that they listed the employee hadn't returned to work, in the section where they were supposed to put, when the II took place. But what it is, you throw everything at the wall, every little piece of information that you have, and then the totality of it, like in that instance, got the 14-day completely gone, and then we were talking letter of warning. And then it ended up there being a couple months of a 7-day, because he did let the LLV roll away and run away 75 feet, jump a curb, and then smash into an AT&T box. But because they made all those mistakes and all those problems, we were able to show it was sloppy. They were just pencil whipping the whole thing. And so, use all this information, poke holes, throw rocks at their arguments. So kind of some final thoughts on this information request on the file that you're building. Don't leave it in an unsecure location. Don't leave it in the drawer at your case. If you want, you can put it in your locker at work, but have a lock on it, or take it home with you. Keep it in the trunk of your car. Don't have it in an unsecure place. Have it someplace that nobody else can access it. Don't be lazy. Like I said before, discipline, this is the path, determination for the grievant. Someone's got a family, they got bills to pay, this is their career, and even just a letter of warning. If it's doesn't meet just cause, we need to fight it with everything we got. Because if we just say, okay, well, here's 6 months letter warning, it's not a big deal. Well, after that, you got a 7-day, 14-day, and a termination. So they're just 3 steps away from being, on the unemployment line. Also, a final thought was to remember the burden of proof is on the union for contractual grievances. You did overtime wrong. I'm going to prove how. You denied this vacation request unjustly. I'm going to prove how. The burden of proof is on management for disciplinary grievances. So we're coming up with all the information saying you didn't meet just cause. Look, first just cause principle. Is there a rule? You're saying that you're issuing a letter of warning because he didn't answer your phone calls at home. Can you show me in any handbook and manual where it states we have to answer your phone calls? And then you just stop talking and let them reply. There's not a rule anywhere for that. So the burden of proof is on them in discipline. That's what I mean by that. As you're going through your information requests, start making notes. I always take a little notepad and I start jotting them down. So that way, I'm if there's a lot of information, that you're going through, you kind of want to start having an outline. And that way you're already prepared for when you're going to meet it informal, because you've got a logical order for these things. Hey, Mr. Supervisor, Mrs. Supervisor, I'm filing this grievance because I don't feel like you met just cause. And if we look in Article 16, the very first topic, is there a rule? Here's why I feel like you didn't meet just cause. And also remember, the union's always the moving party. It's not up to management to meet within 14 days. It's up to us to let them know, hey, here's the deadline. When can we meet? When can we do this? Sometimes you need to have a time extension. I would recommend that they be rare. You don't do them often. You always want to do them in writing. And you'd add a written statement to the file that the informal A parties agree that the grievance is timely. That way, even though they may tell you to your face that, yeah, we'll do a 5-day extension, your kid was sick and you couldn't be here. If you have it in writing, that's going to be what's important. Also, remember, it's a two-way street. One time I had a supervisor deny me an extension, saying, we don't do extensions here. I was like, okay, bub. And I even told him, I said, hey, there may be one day you want one. He's like, I told you, we don't do extensions here. 3 months later, he called me at 5:30 in the morning saying, hey, I can't meet today. The kid's sick and the wife, she's sick too, and I need to stay home. And I said, okay, man, do you need an extension? He's like, yeah, can we do it till Tuesday? I said, no problem on one condition. Are you going to grant me the same in the future? And you know what? He literally paused. And he was trying to figure out on the spot how he could avoid doing the extension. He ended up ultimately agreeing that if I needed it, he would grant it. So that's what I mean by it's a two-way street. If you expect them to give you an extension that's reasonable, make sure that, you grant the same courtesy to them. And the other note is to read the NLC Stewards Guide. Like I said, that's super handy. And, today a lot of this was about the information request. These are really helpful because it also prevents management from trying to introduce new evidence at later stages of the dispute resolution process, especially at arbitration, because we have in writing what we requested and then we documented exactly what they gave us. So maybe they did leave something out that I noticed they left out. I decided not to ask for it. We have the meeting and I'm like, hey, here's what you gave us. This is why we feel like you didn't meet just cause. It goes to Formal A. They have in writing what was requested. Formal A can introduce new information, but evidence. Let's say they don't. And then it goes to step B. From that point on, they can't add anything additional. So if they're in arbitration and they try to introduce something brand new, oh, hey, I have an interview here from so-and-so. If they didn't introduce that at Formal A or at informal, it can't be admitted. And even though at the informal level, it's called informal for a reason, right? You're not in a suit and tie. You're just in your uniform, sitting there at a desk with the supervisor. You need to be treating every one of these and preparing them as if this may go to arbitration. Take your time. Use all 14 days. Well, like I said, 13 days, leave yourself a little wiggle room at the end. But don't find out the incident date, put in your information request, and then be ready to meet, within the next day. If you need the time to thoroughly go through it and build the file properly, take that time, because further down the line in the dispute resolution process, like possibly at arbitration, your actions could potentially determine a precedent going forward for all of Oklahoma City, all of, the Oklahoma-Arkansas district, depending what type of arbitration it is. And so it's just, it's real important that you keep that in mind, that we treat every one of them, like they're going to arbitration. Lastly, if you don't know, ask for help. Just really ask for help. Even now, I'll still reach out to Eric Bew and, bounce an idea off of him. I'll hit up Casey. Casey recently, hit up me, with a question about something. Find somebody that can be your mentor in a sense, and also find someone that you can bounce ideas off of. These people are relying on us. They pay their union dues. We volunteered to be that person in your station and step forward. And so, obviously you're wanting to put the time in to get better because you're here on this Zoom with me tonight. And I would just encourage you that, as you go forward in this process of becoming a stronger steward, more confident, more knowledgeable as, time goes on, never be afraid to ask for help. Because another steward might come up with something that you didn't think about. Having a second set of eyes could potentially really be helpful. So here in a second, we're going to open it up for questions. That's pretty much all I have for now. Next month, we're going to have the training's going to be over the just cause principles. And so, like I said, a little bit of homework between now and then. Read those and get familiar with them. Maybe jot them down like I had done. Just cause principle 1, just cause principle 2. That way, throughout the month, it's on your mind. So next month when we meet, you can think of that. And so we're going to go ahead and end that portion there. This is going to be on the podcast, and nobody's questions will be on the podcast. So from this point forward, if anybody asks anything, you won't be out there for the whole world.